Rawteur. Most lawsuits happen when a movie copies too much. This one happened because Never Say Never Again didn't copy enough of Thunderball. We'll do a side-by-side comparison to find out why the estate of Ian Fleming sued Kevin McClory in 1982. First impressions matter, especially for a character as iconic as James Bond. The opening of a Bond film doesn't just introduce the plot, it sets the tone for who Bond is and what kind of adventure we're about to see.
Madame, I've come to offer my sincere condolences.
Bond movies always establish their lead actor right away. In Thunderball, the first time we see Bond, he's attending a funeral. He's sharp, confident, in complete control of the situation. Then, when the fight breaks out, he's fast, brutal, and precise. He takes out a Spectre agent, uses a jetpack to escape, and lands like it's just another day at the office. This is Bond at his peak. He's young, dominant, and invincible. Now we look at Never Say Never Again. This Bond isn't crashing a Spectre meeting or taking out an assassin. He's in a controlled training simulation and he loses. He gets stabbed in the gut and dies. Right away, the audience is being told that this is an older Bond, a Bond who's lost a step. Even M tells him that the 00 section is outdated and that he's basically being forced into retirement. In Thunderball, the opening tells us that Bond is at the top of his game, but Never Say Never Again immediately challenges that image, showing us a Bond who might not be fit for the job anymore. Therefore, this isn't just a different take on the character, it's a direct challenge to EON's version of Bond. If this Bond was accepted, it meant audiences might prefer an aging, more vulnerable Bond over the unstoppable action hero EON had been selling for years. And if this Bond could age, what did that mean for the future of the franchise? That fear of change is exactly why the lawsuit wasn't just about rights, it was about control. And one of the clearest ways Never Say Never Again challenged the Bond formula was in how it handled Bond's relationships. James Bond has always been a symbol of hitting the like button. A Bond movie is only as good as its villain. The best ones are like a force of nature.
Yes? It's Chris.
Gently, my friend, gently. You let him get the better of you.
No, he wasn't a beast. He wasn't. No.
In Thunderball, Largo is cold, methodical, and menacing. He wears an eye patch, controls an army of henchmen, and commands respect through power. He's a classic Bond villain, larger than life and untouchable. Now compare that to Never Say Never Again. This Largo is different. He's not just a Spectre agent, he's a possessive and emotionally unstable man obsessed with domino. He doesn't radiate power in the same way. Instead, he's erratic, insecure, and sadistic in a way that's more psychological than physical. Largo in Thunderball is the perfect Bond villain. Big, intimidating, and representative of the kind of over-the-top espionage action that defined the series. But Never Say Never Again makes him more personal, more flawed, and less of a grand mastermind. Therefore, it shifts the entire dynamic of the story. Instead of being about Bond taking down an untouchable criminal empire, it's about Bond navigating a deeply personal conflict. This wasn't just another small change. It was another fundamental departure from EON's Bond formula. And the biggest change of all was how the entire movie ended. A Bond movie's climax is more than just a fight. It's the final statement on what kind of Bond film you're watching. The ending of Thunderball is classic Bond spectacle, an all-out underwater battle, harpoon fights, and a massive takedown of Spectre forces. But Bond isn't alone. He's actually leading the charge. Look at Never Say Never Again. Instead of a grand battle, it's a one-on-one struggle. Largo escapes with a nuclear warhead, and Bond has to stop him alone. It's not about leading an army, it's about finishing a personal fight. In Thunderball, Bond is a leader, taking down a massive organization. But Never Say Never Again strips that away, making it a smaller, more intimate confrontation. Therefore, it presents a very different kind of Bond story, one where the spectacle is secondary to the personal stakes. And that's why EON saw it as a threat. If this Bond worked, if audiences accepted a version that wasn't about larger-than-life spy action, but about a more grounded and emotional Bond, it could have reshaped what people expected from the franchise. And that's exactly why they sued. Not because Never Say Never Again was too much like Thunderball, but because it was too different. Different enough to compete. But that lawsuit was just one battle in a much longer war. A war that had been raging since before Thunderball was ever a movie. And it all started with a handshake deal that fell apart. If you want to hear every legal argument word for word straight from the court documents, consider becoming a member and joining the jury pool. You'll get exclusive videos, early access to content, and much more. Now, the chaos and drama began back in 1958 when Irish filmmaker Kevin McClory teamed up with Ian Fleming and Ivar Bryce to create a James Bond film. At this point, Bond had never been on the big screen. McClory, fresh off directing The Boy in the Bridge, was seen as a rising talent. Bryce, a close friend of Fleming, helped bring them together. At first, things looked promising. Fleming even wrote to McClory saying, "After seeing your work on The Boy in the Bridge, there is no one who I would prefer to produce James Bond for the screen." McClory wanted the film to be a massive production, but Fleming was used to writing books, not navigating big-budget filmmaking. Hey jurors, future me here. I left a part out. McClory's film, The Boy and the Bridge, ended up not doing so well. This caused Ian Fleming and Ivar Bryce to lose faith in him as a producer. Therefore, by March 1960, Fleming was already in discussions with outside studios without McClory's knowledge. Then, Fleming made his move. Instead of waiting for the film to get made, he took the script, turned it into a novel, and published Thunderball in March 1961 without crediting McClory or Whittingham. But what he didn't know was that McClory had already been advised to take legal action. In a letter from the previous year, Fleming seemed confident that McClory wouldn't be able to stop him. He wrote, if McClory's lawyers were faced with all this evidence, they would fall back on the Bryce-McClory agreement of March this year. Essentially, he believed McClory wouldn't have enough leverage. But he was wrong. McClory sued Fleming for copyright infringement, arguing that Thunderball was based on the script they had developed together. The case wasn't just about ownership. It was about proving that Bond's cinematic identity had started with Thunderball. Fleming, already suffering from severe heart problems, hoped to avoid a legal fight. In a private letter, he suggested resolving things like old boys rather than through the courts. But McClory wasn't interested in a quiet settlement. He wanted what he was owed. The legal battle dragged on for 2 years. Then, in 1963, the court ruled in McClory's favor. Fleming was forced to acknowledge McClory's contributions in future editions of Thunderball, and, more importantly, McClory was granted the exclusive film rights to the story. But there was a catch. He didn't have the money to produce the film on his own. That's when EON Productions stepped in. Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, the producers behind the official Bond films, struck a deal. McClory could co-produce Thunderball with them, but under one condition. He couldn't remake it for at least 10 years. Unbeknownst to them, that 10-year waiting period was a ticking time bomb. As soon as it expired, McClory started developing his own Bond film, initially called Warhead, then later retitled Never Say Never Again. It was supposed to be his grand return to Bond, but Broccoli and EON weren't about to let that happen. A letter from EON Productions to McClory dated September 10, 1964, which was around the time of the production of their version of the Thunderball movie. It reveals just how badly they wanted to shut him out. It reads, "We have made unremitting efforts during the last 4 weeks to try to reach agreement with you for the production of Thunderball. We are still a long way from agreement and cannot wait any longer. We are immediately going ahead with On Her Majesty's Secret Service and can no longer discuss the Thunderball matter with you." This letter is key because it confirms that EON wanted McClory to sign away his rights, but he refused. He held on, waiting for the right moment, and that moment came in 1982, when McClory finally secured financing to produce Never Say Never Again. That's when EON and the Ian Fleming estate sued him, but this lawsuit was different. It wasn't about Never Say Never Again copying too much from Thunderball. It was about it not copying enough. The Fleming estate argued that McClory had changed too much from the Thunderball script he had rights to. If Never Say Never Again felt like a new Bond film instead of a remake, McClory could have an alternate Bond franchise that competed with the official one. That was the real threat. The case played out in court under the title The Right Honorable Raymond Arthur Clannaboy O'Neill versus Paramount Pictures, and the ruling was clear. McClory was allowed to release Never Say Never Again. The lawsuit failed to block the film. But this battle wasn't over. McClory spent the next 2 decades trying to expand his claim. He insisted that he owned major portions of the Bond IP, leading to yet another lawsuit in 2001. McClory spent 40 years fighting for Bond, from his Thunderball victory in 1963 to his final legal defeat in the 2000s. What started as a handshake deal between creative partners turned into one of the longest and most complex copyright battles in film history. And here's the irony. McClory's fight to make an alternate James Bond is what led to the legal safeguards that keep Bond under strict control today. If he had won, the Bond franchise might have looked completely different. But he didn't. And because of that, the official Bond we know today remains untouched. James Bond wasn't the first, and it won't be the last. You don't want to miss this next case, right here. How you doing, jurors? Some new James Bond news broke while I was editing this video, so I'm just tacking it on to the end. This is typically how I run the live streams, where I just talk to the camera and read off one of the legal documents or some articles, and we have a discussion. So I'm just using this setup just to read off this information for you guys, just so we put the actual bookend on the story, because who would have thought that a story that you just heard ended in 2001 had an update today. Anyway, so Amazon just took full control of James Bond, and it only cost them $1 billion on top of the $8.5 billion they already overpaid for MGM. That's right. They shelled out all that cash, but still had to cut another massive check to finally push Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson aside. For decades, Broccoli and Wilson kept Bond strictly a movie franchise, refusing to let it turn into some sprawling cinematic universe like Marvel or Star Wars. They kept the quality tight, the storytelling focus, and they fought off spin-offs like that scrapped Jinx movie with Halle Berry. But now, Amazon can do whatever it wants. That means spin-offs, expanded stories, maybe even a Bond TV show. So what's changed? Well, Wilson is retiring, and sources say Broccoli just got tired of fighting off Amazon. And Amazon is a volume-driven company. They don't buy a franchise just to sit on it. They need content. And now that they're also setting up their own theatrical distribution arm for 2026, they need big, bankable brands to fill it. This shift opens the door for directors like Quentin Tarantino or Christopher Nolan, both of whom wanted to make a James Bond movie but couldn't under Broccoli and Wilson's tight grip. Now, Amazon can chase after big name talent and finally cast a new Bond, likely someone young enough to wear the tux for the next decade. Not everyone's thrilled though. Some insiders worry that without Broccoli's oversight, Bond could just become another generic action franchise, comparing it to Amazon's Jack Reacher series. Others point out that Amazon spends big on marketing, so even if Bond loses some of its old charm, it's going to be everywhere. Bottom line, the Broccoli era is over. Amazon is in the driver's seat, and whatever happens next, Bond is about to change, maybe for good, maybe for worse. So that officially puts the book end on the James Bond saga. We'll see what happens over the next coming years with TV shows and spin-offs. And until then, please click the link or the next video wherever I have it on the screen. Peace.